Welcome to the Novel Analyst Podcast, where I analyse stories to help you become a better writer. I'm Jed Hearn, and today's episode is Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson, Controlling Pacing Using Chapters. Steelheart is a YA post-apocalyptic novel about a world where people have got superpowers, but everyone who's received these powers has become insane, villainous epics who now rule the cities and oppress the non-powered people. It follows David, a young boy who tries to assassinate the epic who killed his father, by joining a group of people called the Reckoners, who go around assassinating epics. This is the first Brandon Sanderson novel I read about this time last year, and I loved it. It's so good. Since then, I've read the rest of the series. The Steelheart is the first in a 3-book series called The Reckoners, and the next 2 books are equally as good. And I've read a lot of Brandon Sanderson's other stuff as well. But what I really love about this novel in particular is the pacing. It flows so fast, and I think I read it in a couple of days because it was just such a fast-paced novel. In this episode, I want to try to understand how Brandon Sanderson achieved this. How did he create such a fast-paced novel that was quick to read, fun to read, and had me constantly wanting to know what happened in the next chapter? Well, to begin with, I want to have a look at Structuring Your Novel by K.M. Weiland. And in this book, Weiland outlines the 6 components of a story, the 6 basic building blocks of story. And 3 of these components fall under what she describes as scene, and the other 3 fall under what she describes as sequel. So, in the scene components, we had the goal, conflict, and disaster. So running through those, the goal is the character wants something, can be physical or abstract. However, opposing that goal, we have the conflict, which is an antagonist or something else which blocks the protagonist's attempt to achieve their goal. And then moving on from the conflict, we have the disaster, which is the point where the goal is obstructed, and we get a sense of kind of that all is lost moment. In the sequel components, we get the reaction, where the character responds emotionally to the disaster, whether that's being angry or sad or happy or whatever. Moving on to the dilemma, which is where they have to come up with a new plan. And then the last part of the sequel, which is the decision, which is where they decide to take action or not to take action. And I'll link to this scene sequel format in the show notes. But what I find really interesting about this, actually I'll just recap it one more time. So basically, the scene is goal, conflict, disaster, and it's followed by sequel, which is reaction, dilemma, and decision. And basically every story will have tons and tons of these scene sequel units, where you basically have, it's like a loop, and it just keeps running all throughout the story. But the reason I bring this up is because understanding scene sequel format can help when it comes to deciding where to end your chapters. If you end your chapters between the scene and the sequel, that is, you end the chapters, you go goal, conflict, disaster, end of chapter. Next chapter is reaction, dilemma, and decision. What you've created is a cliffhanger. And you can probably think about a ton of stories that do this. You know, they end the chapter with like the main character pulling out a gun about to shoot someone or something. And then they move on to the next chapter. That's a chapter that's ended right between scene and sequel. By contrast, a chapter that ends after a complete scene and sequel unit will feel complete. It will feel like a cohesive unit of story, almost like a short story, a self-contained event within itself. So for instance, let's say, rather than having the character pull a gun on someone at the end of the chapter, you have it happen in the middle of the chapter, and then by the time you reach the chapter's end, that whole thing's been resolved and like the characters are safe and whatnot. And depending on which format you use, depending on if you have chapter breaks coming between scene and sequel or chapter breaks coming after scene and sequel, it will define the pacing of your novel. A lot of thrillers put the chapter break between the scene and sequel because it makes readers want to know more. You're ending the chapters on a cliffhanger, which is encouraging them to move forward. However, you can't do this all the time because then readers will get exhausted. And if you don't give readers an opportunity to take a break in your 300,000 word epic fantasy, then you're probably going to have some issues when it comes to readers wanting a toilet break. So, in Steelheart, I've done an analysis of all 43 chapters in the book, and that's including the prologue and the epilogue. And what I found was quite interesting. I found that out of the 43 total chapters, 35 ended on a cliffhanger. This meant that they ended right in the middle of that scene sequel format. That's 81% of the book's chapters, ending on cliffhangers. By contrast, we have a mere 8 chapters, or 23% of the book, ending at a relatively cohesive end of a scene sequel format. So basically you can say that 81% of the book, Steelheart, ends on cliffhangers, and 23% ends on quote-unquote rest points, where you feel like things are resolved, you feel like you can put the book down and have a bit of a break. Now, another thing that's really interesting about this analysis, and I'll put a table up on novelanalyst.com explaining the method I use to get all this data out of the book, is if you look at the first couple of chapters of the book, all the way from the prologue through to the end of chapter 5, every single one of those chapters ends on a cliffhanger. And I think this is a really good technique that writers can use, because what it does is it encourages readers to read a lot of your story to start off with. If you kind of end your first chapter on a relatively finished note with not much sense of imminent danger coming to the characters, not much of a cliffhanger, you're probably going to increase the risk of readers putting your book down right then. However, if you can have quite a few opening chapters that are all cliffhangers and all make readers want to keep reading, then you suck them into the world of your story, and then you can eventually have some quieter moments later. So, going through my analysis of Steelheart, I'll go through right now the chapters that are cliffhangers versus the ones that are rest points. So from prologue through to chapter 5, they're all cliffhangers. The last lines of those chapters are things like, Curveball reached for his gun, Fortuity's head exploded, and this deep in the steel catacombs no one would notice a scream or a gunshot. Clearly things that show it's a cliffhanger, that there's something going to happen next and you make readers want to keep turning the pages. At chapter 6, we have our first rest point, where David's starting goal to join the Reckoners so that he can assassinate the superpowered villain who killed his father is shut down by the Reckoners rejecting him themselves. Then from chapters 7 through to 10, we have a whole bunch more cliffhangers there. Chapters 11, we have a relative rest point, coincidentally coming pretty much at the end of the first act at the 24% point. Then from chapters 12 through to 18, all cliffhangers. At 19, we've got another rest point where the protagonists have accomplished their initial goal and are safe, for now at least. 20 and 21, both cliffhangers. 22, rest point. 23 to 29, have a guess? If you said all cliffhangers, you're correct. And then we see something kind of interesting. From chapters 30 to 31, they're both rest points. And this coincides pretty much exactly with the end of Act 2, at the 77% mark of the story. And this is kind of interesting because slowing down the pace here happens because a major character has died. I'm not going to spoil it, but if you've read the book, you'll know who dies around this point. And because of this, we have this moment where it's kind of the lowest of lows, it's the dark night of the soul, and it's marking the start of Act 3. What's interesting here is because so much of the book has been fast-paced and ending on cliffhangers, by giving us a relatively closed chapter with a sense of self-containedness at the end of it, it allows readers to reflect. And you can't always do this. This only works in this case because this chapter's relative slow pace, and not slow pace, but slow paced ending, is in contrast to the other fast-paced chapter endings. Then, as we move into the third act, from chapters 32 all the way to 40, when the main conflict is resolved, they're all cliffhangers. And this is one of the things that you notice with Brandon Sanderson's novels. He has this thing called the avalanche, where basically he wants the last 10% of the novel for you to read that in one go, and stay out no matter how late it is, which is pretty, from memory, the experience I had with this. And then finishing off the analysis, chapters 41 and the epilogue are both closed-ended, which is fair. You probably don't really want the last chapter of your book to end on a cliffhanger. You can still have things unresolved, and that's what Sanderson does here. He allows some minor plot threads from the first novel to be unresolved so that you can follow those up in the next 2 books in a trilogy. However, the main goal is accomplished, and there's a sense of closure because of that. So in summary, what we've learnt so far from Steelheart is that if you want to have a fast-paced novel, have your chapter endings coming right in the middle of that scene-sequel format, so they're forming cliffhangers. But what else can we learn from Steelheart? Well, according to my Excel spreadsheet I have here, quite a lot. Interestingly enough, the words per chapter in Steelheart is coming in at an average of about 2,500. Now this is interesting because if you compare it to Mistborn: The Final Empire, which I've analysed in a previous episode, that has an average chapter length of 5,200 words. And this disparity can be sort of explained by the different genres. They're sort of, like Mistborn: The Final Empire is sort of kind of like epic fantasy, probably more adult audience, whereas this is more like YA audience. And also, Mistborn has 208,000 total words compared to Steelheart's 108,000 total word count. But I think it goes a long way towards explaining why Steelheart feels a lot faster to read, even if it is shorter. Because when you have shorter chapters, you have a greater sense of narrative progression. Readers feel like they're plowing through the book a lot faster. And part of that comes to like the literal fact that like the more chapters you have, the shorter chapters you have rather, the more you're actually going to be turning pages because there'll be like more pages with less text on them and stuff. So that's where you get that whole idea of a page turner. And if you think about a lot of James Patterson novels, for instance, they're not actually that long, like they're probably 60 to 70,000 words, but they look big, and that's because there's tons of short chapters, which means there's a lot of white space, which means lots of page turning, and you get that whole like thriller feeling where you like to turn the pages quickly because it's fast paced and you want to find out who killed the guy and whatever. Another interesting point about Sanderson's chapters here is that 34% of the cliffhanger chapters end on a line of dialogue. And I think this is an interesting technique that goes back to that whole idea of getting in late and leaving early when it comes to scene writing. Because when you're ending on the dialogue, rather than having, say, for instance, the character internally process that a bit and being like, oh, the person said that I had to get my gun because we're leaving soon to assassinate this supervillain or whatever, you just say, go get your gun then, they're leaving soon, as in chapter 15. And what that does is it lets readers kind of anticipate what's going to happen next. And it cuts out a lot of redundant stuff as well, because a lot of the time these like dialogue endings are like a command or, you know, a statement of a mission they're going to go on or something like that. So in summary, some of the ways that you can use chapters to control pacing in your novel is think about scene-sequel format. Inserting your chapter breaks between scene and sequel will create a sense of a cliffhanger, which will create faster pacing. However, it's good to balance these things. In particular, one thing that Steelheart really does well, as I mentioned before, is that the first, say, 15% of the book, all cliffhanger endings to get readers immersed and hooked into the story. Secondly, think about how you can use contrast in your chapter endings to reinforce emotional heights and lows in your story. For instance, if your story is all very fast-paced, think about where you want to insert those slow rest points at the ends of chapters where it's a cohesive, finished unit of story. And that's where you can insert, like, you know, notable, say, for instance, reactions to character deaths or, like, big news or major game-changing events like that. And lastly, while this is obviously a broad generalization, shorter chapters generally contribute to faster feeling novels. Novels with long chapters of like 10,000 words or whatever are probably going to feel like slower reads than novels like Steelheart that only have about 2,500 words per chapter. In conclusion, I think the thing I enjoy most about Steelheart, and I think the reason why it's such a good book for writers to read, is because it's just a perfectly structured novel. There's a lot of perception that the more something is structured, the more something is planned, the more something adheres to a clear set of guidelines, the more banal and cliche it's going to be. But that's not the case here. What Brandon Sanderson does with this novel is he shows how the perfect execution of structure, the perfect execution of different beats in the story, creates an amazing, emotionally satisfying, fantastic story. Thanks for listening to the Novel Analyst Podcast. Want to help me assassinate some supervillains? Then leave a rating in iTunes to show your support. And if you want to subscribe to the show, go to novelanalyst.com/subscribe.